Time for question number 2. And Ms. Miller, some people in the rural parts of Oregon are frustrated with state lawmakers and don't feel represented. Some have talked about joining a greater Idaho. What would you do to better represent them and address that?
I think this is something where this is interesting because as a tribal person who comes from a sovereign nation, there are actually a lot of issues and a lot of things that I think people in the district who might have different viewpoints, we can agree on and we can have bigger conversations. And so, you know, for me, I think it can be difficult because I am a Native American woman who grew up in this district, and I did experience racism. I did experience sexism in my public education from my school board members, a lack of advocacy or representation from my elected representatives. So this is hard for me because as someone who was raised in a tribal family with a lot of traditions, a lot of these values as a tribal person, you contribute to your community. You have a responsibility with every privilege you have to come back and put that into the growth of your communities. That exists within this district as well. So I want to encourage people, and I don't want to silence people, and I don't want to dominate people, and I understand that people are struggling within this district, but I don't support this move to Greater Idaho. I think we need to start having better conversations and strengthening those, and what does this really mean, and how can we connect with each other too and have better conversations. I think I want to represent people by being the best candidate and making the best decisions policy-wise and doing the most to get resources into this rural district to support everything across the board: education, childcare, economic growth, renewable energy, all of these things that we're lacking that will actually really benefit people's daily quality of lives. And being elected into this legislature and being able to be a champion, because I am a Democrat and will work strongly with the leadership in the state to make these things happen, people will see those impacts in their lives, and that will make them feel heard and make them feel understood. And I will make sure I strive to go out to every community and have conversations and make sure everybody is heard, because I know what it is like to not be represented.
All right, very good. Thank you, Ms. Miller. Same question to you, Senator. Some people in rural parts of Oregon are frustrated with state lawmakers and don't feel represented. They're talking about joining a Greater Idaho. What would you do to better represent them and address that issue?
Well, thank you for the question. I share their frustrations in a lot of regards. We're saddled with a one-size-fits-all. What works well on the west side, they adhere to the east side, and we have to deal with that, and it makes it very difficult. It does not work for the Eastern Oregonians. The best way to represent people is to have conversations with them. The last election cycle, when I ran for the House, I had 57 town hall meetings, were meet and greets, coffees, just to meet with constituents and have those conversations. Obviously, we can't do it this year because of COVID, so I've had virtual town halls. I've held 9 virtual town halls that average between 150 and 250 people each time to get their input and see how they feel about stuff. But I've also attended some of these meetings on the state of Jefferson or the Greater Idaho, and there's just frustrations. I mean, I think 25 years of Democratic leadership in this state ignoring rural Oregon shows that's what you get. I mean, the Democrat leadership has absolutely ignored Eastern Oregon, and it takes a strong voice. I work very hard to work across the aisle and collaboratively with my colleagues to pass legislation and make our voice heard. I passed more legislation in the last long session in the House than any other House member, because I worked hard with my Democratic colleagues to get to the point we needed to get to. You know, I passed 911 legislation to increase the funding for 911 centers, because in rural Oregon you have a 911 center that has about a third the funding that Western Oregon has. It just makes it difficult for these folks to get along. We have to do the same thing that they do in Western Oregon on a third the money, and it makes it very difficult.
Okay, all right, thank you, sir. Ms. Miller, 30 seconds on that point.
Okay. Well, I think what I will say is that, you know, I think it gets frustrating as a rural Oregonian who, you know, comes from an infinite family of rural Oregonians, when there's a narrative that the Democrats of the state are the ones not willing to work, when it's my elected representatives who are not willing to show up and do their jobs. And so, you know, and I also think it's important that we acknowledge these relationships. It's hard to serve a community of people when you're taking over $14,000 in funds from corporate pharmaceutical companies, when you're voting against the expansion of broadband bills and taking money from companies in broadband. We need to start acknowledging some of these relationships and the impacts they're having on votes too.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Time's up on that. You have 30 seconds, Senator, on the point.
Thank you. You know, I would say there is a lack of representation in Eastern Oregon from Western Oregon folks. And it's not whether you get contributions or something, you know, your vote's not for sale. You work hard to do it. When I represent my district, whether I'm in the building or outside of the building. When the rules get changed and flexed and they don't play by the same rules, then and your voice is absolutely not heard. You take every measure that you can to represent your people.
All right, thank you, sir. Time now for the fun and games we like to call candidate question time. Instead of my asking a question this time, you get to ask each other a question. And Ms. Miller, we begin with you as you won the coin flip. So it's your opportunity. You can ask a question, and then, sir, you'll have a minute to respond.
So, Senator Findley, I just do want to thank you for your public service. I have acknowledged that you have a long career of public service from BLM all the way into being appointed into this seat. And my question for you is, you have been an appointed representative to elect us, but you have never represented me. So why and why do you want to continue, and how do you plan on representing people like me in this district?
Well, let me tell you, when I was appointed to the Senate, middle of January, I picked up all of House District 59, which was the first thing I noticed when I got in there as the session started was the significant issue you have in water and wastewater system within the reservation, and the lack of ability and the fact you had a boil order. I worked with the Capital Construction Committee, passed a $7.8 million budget to fund that start of that work. When the coronavirus kicked in, the lottery funds left, and we had to find another way to find those money. I worked with the emergency board to get those funds for them. So I understand the need for infrastructure. I understand the water and wastewater issues are critical. And I went to work immediately to find funding for that. You know, and so far we're about $8.2 million specifically for the Warm Springs Indian Reservation for water systems. Hopefully remove the boil order.
All right, thank you, sir. Karina Miller, you have 30 seconds to respond to his response.
Well, you know, I do also appreciate the work you did on that, and I did follow it. But I think my point in this is that, you know, I was an elected tribal councilor, not by choice, but by necessity, because I see that I have to advocate for my community and people like me. And although I appreciate the money that you did get allocated, the overall need is $200 million. And so this is another example. As a tribal person, I've had to have the skills to navigate these bigger systems and have the understanding to go into the state legislature. But there's not that understanding for tribal communities, and I still feel misrepresented, although I appreciate the effort.
All right, thank you, ma'am. Senator Findley, you have now the opportunity to ask Ms. Miller a question.
Sure, thank you. So I guess my question is what experience do you have that makes you qualified to represent 144,000 people in Eastern Oregon with diverse needs, diverse natural resource issues in Senate District 30?
Great question. So, you know, I already spoke about being elected onto the 27th Warm Springs Tribal Council, and the reality is that I spent 3 years as an elected official for a sovereign nation, where I did work on actual laws, on work groups, crafting policy to be proposed to the legislature. So there's that experience, but there's also the long history of the Warm Springs tribe doing land management and doing natural resources programs throughout the state of Oregon. The experience that my tribe and my tribal leaders and my family poured into me, and the grooming that took place to understand not just the responsibility of modern day land management, but thinking 7 generations ahead, all of that has made me extremely experienced and by far the best candidate to put forward for the future of Senate District 30.
All right. Senator, you have 30 seconds to respond to that.
Well, I appreciate that. You know, when people ask me what my priorities are for my district, I'll say, well, which county do you want to talk about? Because every county is different. Every county has different needs, different economies. So it's not a one-size-fits-all by any means. You have incredibly rich agricultural land from, 60% of the rural's carrot seed in Jefferson County to 40% of the continental United States onion crop in Malheur County, to timber, to torrefaction of woody biomass, to converting
All right.
of biomass. So
Thank you, sir.
There's
Very
just
good.
a lot. So
Our next question now.